Just after 2 in the morning local time, a barrage of rockets and one-way attack drones came in low over the perimeter of a U.S. military installation in the region, aimed directly at aircraft shelters, fuel storage, and a housing area where American personnel were sleeping. Alarms sounded, base defense systems engaged, and for several tense minutes, commanders on the ground genuinely did not know whether this was going to be the incident that produced American casualties in this conflict. It was not. Every single interceptor and defensive system on that base did exactly what it was designed to do, and when the smoke cleared, the official damage report read the way every commander prays it will read after an attack of this scale. No U.S. personnel killed, no U.S. personnel wounded. What happened next is the part of this story most coverage is rushing past. Within hours, the White House response to an attack that killed nobody was more aggressive, more immediate, and more consequential than the response to several previous incidents in this conflict that did produce casualties. I am going to walk you through exactly what hit that base, how its defenses held, and why the administration's decision to respond the way it did to an attack with 0 American deaths may end up being remembered as one of the more significant strategic choices of the entire campaign. Stay with me, because there is a detail about what was actually being stored near that base's aircraft shelters that changes how seriously you should take this entire incident. Before I walk you through the sequence, I want to be upfront about how I'm approaching this one, because an attack on an American base and a major White House response in the same news cycle tends to produce a flood of exaggerated claims, almost immediately. And separating what is actually confirmed from what is speculation is the whole point of this breakdown. My background is in military strategy and base defense systems, specifically how layered air defense architecture is built to handle exactly this kind of saturation attack. Where something is confirmed by multiple official statements or independent trackers, I'll say so directly. Where it's still developing or genuinely disputed, I'll tell you that too. Let's get into it. To understand why this attack is being taken so seriously despite producing no American casualties, you first need to understand what this base actually does and why it was targeted at all. Forward operating installations like this one across the region are not simple outposts. They function as logistics hubs, aircraft maintenance and refueling points, air defense nodes protecting a much wider footprint than the base perimeter itself, and in many cases, as staging points for exactly the kind of long-range missions we've covered on this channel before. A base like this sits at the intersection of several strategic functions at once, which is precisely why it represents a high-value target for Iran and its regional proxy network, and precisely why an attack against it, even one that fails to produce casualties, is read by military planners as something considerably more significant than a symbolic gesture. It also helps to understand who is actually doing the attacking in cases like this one, because it's rarely as simple as Iran's own military launching rockets directly. Much of the rocket and drone activity directed at American installations across the region over the course of this conflict has come from a loose network of Iran-aligned militia groups operating across several countries, forces that receive training, funding, and weapon systems from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but that operate with a degree of tactical independence that gives Tehran a layer of deniability it would not have if its own uniformed forces were conducting these strikes directly. That arrangement lets Iran apply sustained pressure on American installations throughout the region without every single incident being directly and unambiguously attributable to the Iranian state itself, a strategic ambiguity that has shaped how the United States has calibrated its responses throughout this conflict up to this point. The threat itself came as a combined arms saturation attack, a mix of short-range rockets and one-way attack drones launched from multiple directions within a narrow time window, a tactic that has become increasingly common among Iran-aligned militia networks precisely because it is designed to overwhelm point defense systems that are built to intercept a handful of incoming threats, not dozens arriving from different bearings nearly simultaneously. This is not a new tactic in this conflict, but the scale and coordination of this particular barrage, according to base defense officials, represented one of the larger simultaneous attacks directed at a single American installation since hostilities in the region intensified. That scale is exactly why the outcome, 0 American casualties, is being treated as a genuinely significant defensive success rather than simply good luck. Here's what we know about how the defense actually unfolded. Layered air defense at installations like this one typically combines short-range interceptor systems designed for close-in threats, longer-range systems capable of engaging targets further out, and increasingly, electronic warfare systems designed to jam or spoof the guidance systems of incoming drones before they ever reach the point where a physical interceptor is needed. Base officials described a defense that engaged the incoming barrage across multiple layers simultaneously, intercepting the significant majority of the threats before impact, while the smaller number of rockets and drones that got through struck areas of the base that, by a combination of design and fortune, were not occupied at the time. Some physical damage to infrastructure, including at least one aircraft shelter and sections of the fuel storage area, has been confirmed. What has not happened, and what every official statement since the attack has been careful to emphasize, is a single American injury or death. This is the detail I mentioned at the top of this video that most coverage is glossing over. The aircraft shelters that were among the barrage's intended targets were not simply parking structures. Bases with this kind of strategic function typically use hardened shelters to protect specific high-value aircraft and equipment from exactly this kind of attack, meaning the attackers were very likely not firing indiscriminately at the base in general, but targeting the specific infrastructure believed to house the most valuable assets present. Whether the attack actually struck any of that equipment, or whether it had already been dispersed or relocated in anticipation of exactly this kind of strike, a pattern we've discussed before in this conflict, remains one of the genuinely unconfirmed parts of this story. If sensitive equipment was successfully protected through dispersal ahead of the attack, that tells you American commanders had specific intelligence anticipating this exact scenario. If it wasn't, and the shelters were struck while still holding valuable assets, the physical damage here may be considerably more significant than the "no casualties" headline alone suggests. Now let's get into the response, because this is where the story becomes genuinely unusual. In previous incidents throughout this conflict, American responses to attacks that produce no casualties have generally followed a more measured pattern: proportional retaliatory strikes against the specific launch sites or units responsible, public statements emphasizing restraint alongside resolve, and a general effort to avoid escalation beyond what the triggering incident seemed to call for. That is not what happened here. Within hours of the attack being confirmed and the all-clear given on the base, reporting indicates the administration authorized a retaliatory strike package considerably larger in scope than the triggering attack itself, targeting not just the specific launch sites involved, but a broader set of Iran-aligned militia infrastructure and command nodes across multiple locations, a response scale that several defense analysts described as disproportionate to an attack that, in the end, produced 0 American casualties. That disproportionality is exactly the point, according to people who study how this administration has approached deterrence throughout this conflict. The strategic logic being read into this response by analysts is that punishing outcomes rather than intentions, responding harder to attacks that fail than to attacks that succeed, would create a perverse incentive structure where adversaries are effectively rewarded for competent, restrained targeting and only punished when their own attacks kill Americans. By instead responding aggressively to an attack specifically because it represented such a serious, coordinated attempt regardless of its ultimate outcome, the administration appears to be sending a deliberate signal that intent and scale of attack, not just body count, will determine the scale of American response going forward. Several officials, without confirming operational specifics, characterize the logic behind the scale of the response as being about deterring the next attempt rather than simply punishing this one, language consistent with exactly that read. This kind of deterrence logic is not entirely new in how great powers have historically thought about retaliation, but it represents a meaningful departure from how this specific conflict has generally been managed up to this point. Earlier incidents in this campaign, including several that did produce American casualties, were met with responses that were widely described at the time as measured, proportional, and calibrated specifically to avoid a wider regional war. A response of this scale to an attack with 0 fatalities breaks from that pattern sharply enough that it is already being treated by regional governments and international observers as a genuine signal of a broader shift in how this administration intends to manage escalation for the remainder of the conflict, not simply an isolated one-time overreaction to a single close call. This represents a meaningful shift in the deterrence calculus that regional adversaries have been operating under for months. If a large-scale, coordinated saturation attack against a major American installation produces a response that is bigger, not smaller, when the base's own defenses succeed in preventing casualties, that removes a strategic incentive that has arguably shaped how these attacks have been planned throughout the conflict. Attacking forces have generally had some reason to expect that a failed or partially failed attack carries less consequence than a successful one. A response of this scale to an attack that killed nobody directly challenges that assumption, and multiple analysts have suggested that adversary planning in the near term may need to account for the possibility that scale and intent, not just outcome, now drive the size of the American response. It's worth being honest about the risk this approach carries alongside its logic. A deterrent strategy built around punishing attempted scale rather than just realized harm runs the risk of appearing to some regional and international observers as an escalation disproportionate to the actual damage inflicted, particularly in a conflict where public messaging on both sides is being watched closely by allies, adversaries, and neutral parties alike. Whether this response is remembered as a smart, forward-looking deterrent that successfully raised the cost of large-scale attacks, or as a moment that meaningfully widened the conflict without a proportional trigger, will likely depend heavily on how Iran-aligned forces respond to it in the coming days and weeks, which is genuinely still an open question at this point. Let's talk about what this means for the wider trajectory of the conflict. Throughout this campaign, we've seen a pattern where each side tests the boundaries of what the other will tolerate, learns from the response, and adjusts its next move accordingly. A response this significant to an attack that produced no casualties resets that testing process in a meaningful way. Iran-aligned militia networks across the region, who have used exactly this kind of saturation attack tactic against American installations multiple times over recent months with a fairly predictable and proportionate American response each time, now have to reassess that pattern entirely. The old calculation that a failed or mostly intercepted attack carries limited consequence no longer appears to hold, and that uncertainty itself may do more to shape near-term behavior than the physical damage from any single retaliatory strike. There's also a base defense angle to this story worth sitting with, because the fact that layered defenses successfully intercepted the significant majority of a large, coordinated saturation attack is itself a genuinely important data point independent of the political response. Defense planners across the region will be studying exactly how this particular combination of interceptor systems and electronic warfare performed against a real large-scale coordinated attack, because a successful defense of this scale under real conditions provides validation that training exercises and simulations simply cannot replicate. If this defensive performance holds up under closer analysis in the coming weeks, it may shift how other American installations across the region prioritize investment in similar layered defense systems going forward. It's worth noting, too, how much this outcome depends on years of accumulated investment that rarely gets attention until a night exactly like this one puts it to the test. Layered air defense of this kind isn't a single system bought off a shelf. It's a carefully integrated architecture of radar coverage, short and long-range interceptors, electronic warfare tools, and rapid command and control decision-making, all of which have to function together correctly within a matter of seconds once a saturation attack begins. Every one of those components has to work and work together for an outcome like zero casualties against dozens of simultaneous incoming threats to be possible. That is a far less dramatic story than the retaliation that followed it, but it may ultimately be the more important one for understanding how survivable American forward presence in this region actually is against exactly the kind of large-scale attack Iran-aligned forces are clearly capable of mounting. Put all of that together, and this single night, a large coordinated attack defeated cleanly by layered defenses, followed by a retaliation scaled to intent rather than outcome, looks less like an isolated incident and more like a genuine turning point in how this entire conflict gets managed from here, with implications for how every Iran-aligned unit in the region now has to weigh the cost of trying and failing against the cost of not trying at all. Let me bring this down to what actually matters here beyond the strategic chess match. An attack of this scale against an American base, one large enough that officials themselves described it as among the more serious, coordinated attempts of the conflict ending with 0 American deaths and 0 American wounded, is, on its own terms, a genuinely significant outcome, not simply a footnote before the more dramatic retaliation story. Every person stationed at the base woke up the next morning, specifically because a layered, expensive, carefully maintained defense system did exactly what it was built to do under real, high-pressure conditions. That is worth acknowledging clearly, independent of whatever comes next in the broader conflict. Before you go, I want to ask you 2 things directly. First, if this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what actually happened here than the shorter clips and headlines circulating elsewhere, share it with one person trying to make sense of this conflict. That's genuinely the only way careful analysis like this reaches people, instead of getting buried under louder, less careful content. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think responding harder to an attack that failed than to some attacks that succeeded is the right long-term deterrence strategy? Or do you think it risks escalating a conflict beyond what the actual damage on the ground justifies? Drop your assessment below. I read every one of them, and if this video delivered real value, a like helps it reach people who need a clear-headed breakdown instead of speculation. Here's where this stands. A large, coordinated saturation attack combining rockets and one-way attack drones struck a major American installation in the region, targeting aircraft shelters, fuel infrastructure, and housing areas, and was defeated by layered base defenses that intercepted the significant majority of incoming threats, resulting in confirmed infrastructure damage, but 0 American deaths and 0 American wounded. Whether the aircraft shelters targeted in the attack were struck while still holding valuable equipment, or whether that equipment had already been dispersed ahead of the strike, remains genuinely unconfirmed. In response, The administration authorized a retaliatory strike package considerably larger in scale than the triggering attack, targeting a broader set of Iran-aligned militia infrastructure. A response analysts describe as intentionally disproportionate, aimed at shifting deterrence away from rewarding failed or intercepted attacks and toward punishing scale and intent regardless of outcome. That shift represents a meaningful change in the deterrence calculus this conflict has operated under for months, one that Iran-aligned forces will now have to factor into their own planning, and one whose ultimate wisdom will depend heavily on how the coming days of response and counter-response actually unfold. Stay locked in on this one, because how both sides answer this moment is likely to shape the next phase of this entire conflict.